Back in 1914, Europe was this powder keg of empires, secret alliances, and, well, a ton of tension. But honestly, no one could have possibly imagined the sheer scale of what was about to happen. This wasn't just another war. It was an industrial slaughter that would completely redraw the map of the world. So, how did it all go so wrong?
I mean, that's the big question, right? How does a single gunshot in a city most people hadn't heard of ignite a fire that burns across the entire planet? Well, the truth is, it wasn't just one event. That assassination was just the final, tiny spark that landed in a powder keg that had been filling up for decades.
So, to really get our heads around this, we're going to walk through the 6 key phases of the war. We'll start with that spark, then see how everything got bogged down in the Great Stalemate. We'll look at how the conflict went global, witness the moment the tides turned, cover the final, desperate offensives, and finally look at the new, broken world that was left behind.
Right, so that spark we talked about, it landed on a continent that was already split right down the middle. You had 2 rival blocks, kind of like 2 giant gangs staring each other down. On one side, you had the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. They were all tangled up in these treaties that meant a little local fight could become everybody's problem fast.
And this is what's so wild. Look at how fast it all unraveled. We're talking a little over a month from one assassination to all of Europe being at war. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia. Russia steps in to defend Serbia. Germany has Austria-Hungary's back, so it declares war on Russia and then preemptively attacks France by marching through neutral Belgium. And that was the final straw for Britain, who had promised to protect Belgium. The dominoes just fell, one after another. And just like that, Europe was at war.
You know, the crazy thing is, everyone thought this would be a quick war. Home by Christmas, they all said. Germany had this thing called the Schlieffen Plan, designed for a knockout blow. But it just didn't work. Instead of these sweeping, heroic battles, the armies on the Western Front literally just dug themselves into the ground.
And that brings us to the thing that defines World War I in our minds, the trench. This wasn't some brilliant strategy, you know? It was pure survival. When you're facing machine guns and massive artillery shells, the only sane thing to do is get below ground level. But what this created was a horrible, bloody stalemate, where hundreds of thousands of men would die to gain maybe a few yards of muddy ground.
If you want to understand just how pointless it all was, just look at this number. Let it sink in. 57,000 casualties in a single day. That was the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Generations of young men ordered to just walk into a hail of German machine gun fire. It's not a statistic, it's an unbelievable monument to the horror of this new kind of war.
So here's the problem in a nutshell. The technology of the 20th century had smashed headfirst into the tactics of the 19th century. The generals were still thinking about cavalry charges, but their soldiers were facing weapons of mass destruction. Machine guns and heavy artillery gave defenders a massive advantage. Barbed wire turned no man's land into a death trap. Poison gas added a whole new level of terror. Even new weapons like tanks were, at first, too slow and unreliable to really make a difference. It was the perfect recipe for a deadlock.
Now, it's so easy to just picture the mud and trenches in France, right? But it's a huge mistake to think the war was only fought there. This was a true world war, fought by massive empires across every continent and ocean on the planet.
I mean, the scale was just immense. While the Western Front was stuck in that stalemate, you had these huge sweeping battles on the Eastern Front between Russia and the Central Powers. Italy was fighting this brutal war up in the Alps against Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire was fighting in the Middle East and the Caucasus. The fighting even spread to colonies in Africa and the Pacific, as powers like Britain and Japan moved in to grab German territories. It was everywhere.
For years, the war was just this brutal, grinding meat grinder. Neither side could land a knockout blow. But then came 1917. And everything, I mean everything, was about to change. 2 massive events on opposite sides of the world were about to break the deadlock for good.
So you've got this huge chess move, right? Over in the East, Russia just implodes. The Tsar is overthrown, and the new Bolshevik government pulls Russia right out of the war. For Germany, this is a massive win. They can now move 500,000 soldiers over to the West. But, and this is a huge but, Germany got cocky. They started sinking any and all ships heading to Britain, including American ones. And then they sent the now infamous Zimmerman telegram, trying to get Mexico to attack the US. That was it. America was in. The clock was now ticking for Germany.
The German High Command could see the writing on the wall.
They knew that millions of fresh American troops were on their way across the Atlantic. It was now or never. So, in the spring of 1918, they took all those soldiers from the Eastern Front and threw everything they had into one last, desperate, all-or-nothing attack.
And at first, oh man, it works like a charm. They used these new stormtrooper tactics and just smashed clean through the Allied lines. But the German army was on its last legs. The offensive ran out of steam, and they got stopped. They had lost over 500,000 of their best, irreplaceable men, and it failed to win the war. The gamble had failed.
And that's when the tables turned hard. With Germany's best troops gone, the Allies, now beefed up with fresh American soldiers, hit back with everything they had. It was called the 100 Days Offensive, and it was just relentless. One German general called the first day the Black Day of the German army, because their morale just shattered. Their allies, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, they all collapsed one by one. And finally, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, Germany signed the Armistice. The guns finally fell silent.
The fighting was over. But the story's not done. Not by a long shot. Now came the hard part, trying to build a new world from the ashes of the old one. But the peace treaty signed at Versailles, well, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about punishment.
The terms were incredibly harsh. Germany lost huge chunks of territory, its military was basically dismantled, and it was handed a bill for war damages so huge it was impossible to pay. But the real kicker, the part that would poison international relations for decades, was the war guilt clause. Germany was forced to accept 100% of the blame for starting the war. You can imagine how well that went down.
The results were just seismic. The entire world map was rewritten. 4, count 'em 4, ancient empires were just gone. The German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian empires vanished from the face of the earth. In their place, new countries were created, borders were redrawn all over Europe and the Middle East, and they even created the League of Nations, a hopeful attempt to make sure something like this could never, ever happen again. But the cost, the human cost, is almost impossible to comprehend. About 16.5 million people dead, soldiers and civilians. An entire generation of young men was just wiped out, and millions more were left scarred for life, both in body and in mind. The world was broken. And that leaves us with this one final chilling thought. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it didn't. In fact, you could argue it did the exact opposite. All those resentments, especially from the Treaty of Versailles, just simmered away until they boiled over into an even bigger, even more horrifying conflict just 20 years later. Which really makes you wonder, did the Great War ever truly end?